The shell landed 60 meters short of the command post. Then another. Then a third, walking steadily closer with the mechanical patience of something that could not be reasoned with, could not be flanked, could not be frightened. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein pressed himself against the wall of the farmhouse cellar near the town of St. Lo in the summer of 1944 and listened to the sound of American artillery finding its range. He had survived the Western Desert. He had ridden through the dust of Libya alongside Rommel himself. He had commanded armor through the catastrophic retreat from Tunisia. He thought he knew what war sounded like. He had never heard anything like this. What Bayerlein experienced that afternoon in Normandy was not simply an artillery bombardment. It was a demonstration of something the German High Command had spent the better part of 3 years refusing to believe, that the United States Army had built the most sophisticated and lethal artillery system in the world, and that it was about to be used to dismantle the Wehrmacht piece by piece, division by division, gun by gun, until there was nothing left to fight with. This is not a story about the broad sweep of battles or the grand movements of armies across maps. It is a story about what happened when some of the finest military minds Germany had ever produced came face to face with American firepower, and what they thought about it afterward, when the fighting was over and the honest accounting could finally begin. If you've ever wondered what Germany's best commanders really thought about their American opponents, stay with us. What they admitted after the war will genuinely surprise you. To understand the shock that American artillery produced in German commanders, you first need to understand what those commanders believed going into the war. The Wehrmacht of 1939 was, by nearly every professional measure, the finest ground army on earth. Its officer corps was steeped in a century of Prussian military tradition. Its doctrine of Auftragstaktik, mission-oriented tactics, gave junior officers the authority to make decisions on the spot without waiting for orders from above. Its combined arms coordination, integrating infantry, armor, artillery, and air power, was years ahead of every potential opponent. German generals were not arrogant men in the casual sense of the word. They were professionals who had studied war deeply and who had earned their confidence through results. Their artillery doctrine reflected this professionalism. The Wehrmacht's artillery arm was well organized, well equipped, and tactically sophisticated. German gunners could lay down accurate fire quickly. They understood the relationship between artillery and the infantry assault. They had refined their techniques in Poland, in France, in the opening campaigns against the Soviet Union. They were good, and they knew they were good. What they had never encountered, what no army on earth had yet encountered, was what the Americans were quietly assembling on the opposite side of the Atlantic between 1940 and 1944. The American artillery system that would eventually stun German commanders had its origins not in battlefield improvisation but in an almost obsessive institutional commitment to solving a specific problem. The problem was simple to state and nearly impossible to solve. How do you mass the fires of dozens or even hundreds of artillery pieces, scattered across miles of terrain, attached to different units firing different calibers, on a single target, accurately within minutes of a request? Every army in the world in 1942 would have told you this was impractical. You could concentrate artillery by physically moving the guns to the same location. You could pre-plan bombardments over hours or days. But responsive, flexible, massed fires from dispersed units, brought to bear on a target of opportunity within 2 or 3 minutes of it being identified. That was not how artillery worked. The Americans decided that was exactly how artillery should work. The instrument they built to accomplish this was the Field Artillery Battalion Fire Direction Center, a system of trained specialists, standardized communications, pre-computed firing data, and rigorous doctrine that allowed an observer anywhere on the front line to call for fire and receive it, in devastating quantity, faster than any German commander would have thought possible. At the heart of the system was something deceptively simple. Every American artillery unit used the same methods, the same terminology, the same mathematical procedures. A forward observer from the 3rd Infantry Division could call for support and receive accurate fire from batteries that had never worked with that division before, because every battery in the American Army had been trained to the same standard. The Germans had nothing comparable. Their artillery support was generally pre-planned or attached at the divisional level. It was effective, but it was not flexible. It could not rapidly shift from one target to another across a wide front. It could not, in the span of a few minutes, bring together the fires of multiple battalions on a single point. German artillery supported the battle. American artillery could reshape it. The man who perhaps came to understand this most vividly, and who was most honest about what it meant, was General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein. By the summer of 1944, Bayerlein commanded the Panzer Lehr Division, one of the finest armored formations in the German army. It had been built from demonstration and training units, men who were literally the instructors of the Wehrmacht, the soldiers tasked with showing others how tank warfare was supposed to be done. It was equipped with the latest armor, the most modern vehicles, the most experienced crews. On the 25th of July, 1944, Bayerlein watched it destroyed in a single afternoon. Operation Cobra was the American breakout from the Normandy bocage country, and it began with something that had never been attempted at that scale in the history of warfare. More than 1,500 heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force dropped nearly 4,000 tons of bombs on a rectangle of Norman farmland roughly 6 kilometers wide and 3 kilometers deep. Behind the bombers came the medium bombers, and behind them came the fighter bombers. And when the aircraft had finished, the American artillery opened up. What followed was not a bombardment in any traditional sense. It was the systematic erasure of everything within a defined area of ground. Panzer Lehr, dug into positions they had held for weeks, ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force in the space of hours. Bayerlein's own account, given after the war during the American military's interviews with captured senior German officers, a program that produced some of the most candid assessments of the war from the German perspective, was blunt to the point of being almost clinical in its horror. He described what happened to his division with the methodical precision of a professional soldier reporting a catastrophic failure of equipment. By the end of the day, he said, his division had lost approximately 70% of its effective strength. Not because of poor tactics, not because of cowardice, because nothing his men could have done would have made any difference against that volume of fire. My frontline troops are done for, Bayerlein reportedly told his superiors. He used a German phrase that translates roughly as, they are finished, kaput. He did not say this with bitterness toward his enemy. He said it as a man reporting a fact. But Bayerlein's experience, as shattering as it was only one example of a pattern that German generals were observing across every front where they encountered American forces. The shock was not isolated to Normandy. It was not the product of one particularly bad day or one particularly well-executed operation. It was the result of a system that worked, consistently, reliably, and with a lethality that grew more pronounced as American forces gained experience. General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded the 5th Panzer Army during the Battle of the Bulge and was one of the most capable operational commanders Germany produced in the entire war, later gave an assessment of American artillery that stripped away any remaining pretense of German superiority in that arm. Manteuffel was not a man given to flattery of his enemies. He was precise, analytical, and deeply experienced. What he said about American artillery, in interviews conducted after the war, reflected conclusions reached through bitter experience. The American artillery, Manteuffel observed, was, and he chose his words with the care of a man who had thought about this for a long time, unique in its organization, its equipment, and above all in its speed. He had fought the French, the British, the Soviets, and the Americans. None of them used artillery the way the Americans did. None of them could bring fire down so quickly on a target. None of them could shift that fire so rapidly from one location to another. And none of them could mass fire from so many different units onto a single point with such accuracy. What made this particularly painful for German commanders was that they understood, from a professional standpoint, exactly what they were seeing. These were men who had studied artillery. They knew what it cost to coordinate fires across multiple units. They knew how difficult it was to train forward observers who could call for fire accurately under combat conditions, while under fire themselves, often with minimal communications equipment, sometimes with nothing more than a map and a radio that might cut out at the worst possible moment. They knew how long it took to work out firing data and relay it to the guns. The Americans made it look almost casual. That was the part that disturbed German generals most. Not the firepower itself, they had quantitative firepower too at various points in the war, but the ease with which American artillery seemed to function. The speed, the accuracy, The way a request for fire could go from a soldier in a ditch looking at a German tank column to shells landing on that column in what seemed like an impossibly short time. The system had been built on a foundation that the Germans had underestimated almost as thoroughly as they had underestimated American industrial capacity, the ability of the United States Army to train enormous numbers of men to a high and uniform standard, and to give those men equipment designed from the ground up to work together seamlessly. The M101 105mm howitzer, which formed the backbone of American divisional artillery throughout the war, was not the most powerful gun on any battlefield in Europe. The Germans had heavier pieces, guns that threw a larger shell to a greater range. But the M101 was reliable, mobile, and used by crews who had been trained with meticulous consistency. The M114 155mm howitzer provided corps-level fires with a shell that weighed nearly 95 pounds and could reach targets nearly 14 kilometers away. Together, these two weapons, employed within the American fire direction system, gave American commanders a tool that their German counterparts came to fear in a way they had feared very few things. Part of what made the American system so effective was something that sounds almost mundane until you consider the operational implications. The Americans had standardized everything. The forms used to request fire support were the same across the entire army. The radio procedures were identical. The mathematical tables used to compute firing data had been printed in manuals distributed to every artillery unit. A battery commander who had spent the last month supporting the 1st Infantry Division could be attached to the 4th Armored Division tomorrow morning and immediately function as part of that division's fire support plan. No relearning. No adjustment period. No confusion. This standardization was the product of years of work by the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, which had spent the interwar years, when the rest of the Army was being starved of resources and attention, refining doctrine and developing the Fire Direction Center concept into something that could actually be taught to hundreds of thousands of men on an industrial scale. German generals learned about this system the hard way, one terrible afternoon at a time. And some of them, at least, were honest enough after the war to say so plainly. General der Infanterie Gunther Blumentritt, who served as Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Rundstedt and was one of the more thoughtful analysts among senior German officers, addressed the question of American firepower directly in the assessments he provided to American military historians after the war. His conclusions were uncomfortable for any German officer's professional pride, but Blumentritt delivered them without evasion. The Americans, he observed, always had artillery available, in any quantity needed at any time it was needed. This was not something any European army had achieved. The British were capable artillerists, he acknowledged. The Soviets had enormous quantities of guns that could overwhelm a position by sheer weight of metal. But the Americans had something different. They had mass and precision and speed simultaneously, and they had trained the men to use all three qualities together in a system that worked even when individual components failed. Blumentritt's assessment touched on something that went beyond mere firepower. He was describing a philosophical difference in how the two armies approached the problem of supporting the soldier in contact with the enemy. The German army of 1944 believed, as a matter of institutional doctrine, that the infantryman was the decisive element of ground combat. Artillery existed to support the infantry assault, to suppress enemy positions, to break up counterattacks. It was a servant of the maneuver arm, necessary and important, but fundamentally subordinate. The Americans had arrived at a subtly but profoundly different conclusion. Artillery was not merely support. It was the primary killer. The infantryman's job, in the American conception of ground warfare that emerged from the fighting in North Africa and Italy and crystallized in northwestern Europe, was largely to find the enemy and fix him in place long enough for artillery to destroy him. The rifle companies moved. The artillery killed. This distinction, which sounds almost philosophical when stated abstractly, had concrete and devastating consequences on every battlefield where German and American forces met. German infantry commanders were trained to think about fire and maneuver, using suppressive fire to allow movement, and movement to achieve positions from which fire could be more effective. American infantry commanders were trained to think about calling for artillery first and moving second, if they needed to move at all. The result was an army that treated its own soldiers' lives with a frugality that German commanders found both admirable and, at moments, almost incomprehensible. Why assault a defended position at the cost of your own men when you could simply call for artillery and let the guns do the killing? This question, obvious in retrospect, reflected an approach to warfare that the Wehrmacht's tradition of aggressive offensive spirit had never fully embraced. The Germans respected courage and initiative. The Americans respected logistics and firepower. Both qualities had their place. But in a long war of attrition against an industrial giant, the American approach had advantages that compounded with every passing month. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, who commanded German forces in the West during the critical period of 1944 and early 1945, and was perhaps the most senior German officer to address American military capabilities with consistent candor after the war, summarized the central problem with characteristic bluntness. The Americans, he observed, never attacked without first preparing the ground with artillery and air. This made them slower, he conceded, and less tactically flexible in the short term than German formations trained in the offensive spirit. But it also meant that when they did attack, the position they were attacking had frequently already been devastated. German soldiers who survived the preparatory fires were often too shaken, too disoriented, too depleted of ammunition and communications to mount effective resistance. The attack itself became almost secondary to the preparation. This observation from Rundstedt, a man who had served in the German army since before the First World War, who had seen every form of industrial age warfare, who had commanded forces against opponents ranging from the French army in 1940 to the Soviet army on the Eastern Front, carried considerable weight. He was not a man who praised enemies lightly. When he acknowledged that American artillery preparation had fundamentally altered the calculus of defensive warfare, he was acknowledging something his own army had failed to anticipate and failed to counter. The failure to anticipate it had roots that stretched back to the earliest days of German intelligence assessments of American military potential. The Wehrmacht's analysts had looked at the United States Army of 1940 and seen what appeared to be a small, poorly equipped, and professionally inexperienced force. All three observations were accurate. What the analysts failed to project was the rate at which American institutional capacity, the training schools, the doctrinal development, the industrial base, could transform that unpromising raw material into a genuinely formidable fighting force. The Field Artillery School at Fort Sill had been working on the Fire Direction Center concept since the early 1930s. The theoretical work had been done. The doctrine had been written. The training programs had been developed. All that was required was the massive expansion of the army itself to put the system into practice at scale. When that expansion came, the Americans did not have to improvise their artillery system. They simply taught the system they had already built to the millions of men who now needed to learn it. If this kind of deeply researched military history is what you come here for, hit subscribe. We go this deep every single time. And if you want to understand just how completely this artillery system reshaped the final year of the war in Europe, stay with us because what happens next is extraordinary. The Battle of the Bulge, which began on the 16th of December, 1944, was Germany's last serious attempt to seize the initiative in the West. The plan was audacious, a concentrated armored thrust through the Ardennes forest, aimed at splitting the Allied line, capturing the vital supply port of Antwerp, and forcing a negotiated peace before Soviet pressure from the East became irresistible. For the first 48 hours, it achieved genuine surprise. American units were overrun. Entire regiments were surrounded or destroyed. The front line, which had been relatively stable, suddenly collapsed in a manner that alarmed Allied commanders at every level. Then the weather cleared, and the American artillery spoke. What happened in the Ardennes over the following weeks became, for many German commanders involved, a kind of final education in what American firepower actually meant at its full development. The Wehrmacht had designed its offensive around speed, break through the American front before it could stabilize, exploit the confusion, reach objectives before reserves could be brought forward. What the German planners had not adequately accounted for was the degree to which American artillery could function effectively even while the broader defensive situation was chaotic. American artillery battalions that had been bypassed or encircled did not simply surrender or flee. They turned their guns and fired in every direction that presented a target. Units that had lost contact with their parent divisions maintained communications with corps artillery and continued to call for and receive fire support. The Fire Direction Center system, which had been designed precisely for the chaos of fluid combat, performed exactly as it had been designed to perform. The town of Bastogne became the focal point of the German offensive's failure, and the artillery of the 101st Airborne Division, supplemented by every battery that could be coordinated from the surrounding corps, demonstrated in miniature what the American system could accomplish even under extreme duress. The division was surrounded. The supply lines were cut. Its ammunition was running critically short. Its men were fighting in temperatures that dropped to well below freezing in inadequate winter equipment. And yet the artillery kept firing. Requests for fire were processed. Targets were engaged. German armored attacks that should have overwhelmed a surrounded airborne division were broken up by guns that had no business still being in action. German commanders watching from outside the perimeter reported, with a frustration that comes through clearly in their after-action accounts, that they could not understand how the American artillery continued to function with such apparent coherence under those conditions. The answer was the Fire Direction Center, the trained specialists who could process a fire mission under shellfire, in the dark with frozen hands, using methods so thoroughly drilled that they had become instinctive. General der Waffen-SS Sepp Dietrich, who commanded the 6th SS Panzer Army during the Bulge Offensive and was not by temperament or background the most analytically inclined of German senior commanders, nevertheless came away from the Ardennes with one conclusion that he expressed with considerable force in post-war interviews. The American artillery, he said, was something that had to be experienced to be believed. He had thought he understood what artillery could do. Ardennes taught him that he had understood nothing. Dietrich's conclusion was shared, in more measured language, by virtually every senior German officer who fought against American forces in the West during the final year of the war. The assessments collected by American military historians in the months and years after Germany's surrender form one of the most remarkable bodies of professional military opinion ever assembled. These were men who had commanded armies and army groups, who had spent their careers studying warfare, who had no reason to flatter their former enemies. And again, on the question of artillery, their conclusions converged on the same point. The Americans had built something genuinely new, something the German army, for all its tradition and professional sophistication, had not built and had not anticipated. And by the time German commanders fully understood what they were facing, it was too late to respond. General der Panzertruppe Erich Brandenberger, who commanded the 7th Army during the Bulge and was responsible for the southern shoulder of the German offensive, provided one of the most technically detailed assessments of American artillery in the post-war interviews. Brandenberger was a careful, methodical man, the kind of officer who thought in precise terms and expressed himself with professional exactness. What he said about American fire support coordination was essentially an admission that the American army had solved a problem that the German army had never even properly defined. The coordination between American forward observers, fire direction centers, and firing batteries, Brandenberger observed, achieved a speed and flexibility of fire support that German forces could not match and could not effectively counter. When a German unit was identified by American observers, shells arrived before any response was possible. When a German counterattack was forming, it was frequently broken up before it could begin. The margin of time that German commanders had always relied upon, the window between detection and response in which action could be taken, had been compressed to the point of irrelevance. This compression of response time had consequences that went beyond the immediate tactical situation. German units learned, through repeated painful experience, that concentration was dangerous. Assembling armor or infantry in any significant mass invited immediate and devastating artillery response. This forced German commanders to disperse their forces, which in turn reduced their offensive capability, weakened their defensive positions, and made coordination between units more difficult. The American artillery system, by its mere existence, was shaping German behavior in ways that served Allied operational objectives without a single infantry engagement being required. General Feldmarschall Walter Model, who commanded Army Group B during the Bulge Offensive and was widely regarded as the Wehrmacht's finest defensive specialist, the man Hitler called his fireman, sent to stabilize crisis after crisis on both fronts, addressed the problem of American firepower in terms that revealed how deeply it had penetrated German operational thinking by the winter of 1944. Model was not a man who acknowledged difficulties easily. He was aggressive, demanding, and relentlessly optimistic in the face of evidence that should have produced despair. But even Model could not pretend that American artillery was anything other than what it was. In communications to his superiors during the Bulge, Model described American fire support as the primary obstacle to achieving the offensive's objectives. Not the weather, not the terrain, not the quality of American infantry, though he respected all of these, but the artillery, the guns that seemed to be everywhere at once, that responded to every German movement with an accuracy and speed that his own artillery arm could not approach, that made every assembly area dangerous and every road march a gamble. What none of these German commanders knew with full clarity, what American commanders themselves sometimes did not fully appreciate in the middle of fighting, was the extent to which the American artillery system was the product of a specifically American approach to institutional problem-solving. The Fire Direction Center had not been invented by a single brilliant theorist. It had been developed, tested, refined, and systematized by a large number of relatively anonymous artillery officers working through the interwar years at Fort Sill, arguing about doctrine in professional journals, running exercises that were underfunded and underattended but that built the conceptual foundation for everything that followed. This was not the German way. The Wehrmacht's excellence rested substantially on individual brilliance. The inspired corps commander, the aggressive panzer leader, the creative staff officer who found the solution that no one else had seen. When German doctrine produced a new approach, it often came from the mind of a single exceptional individual whose insight was then disseminated downward. The Americans built their artillery system through committee, through repetition, through the grinding institutional work of standardizing everything that could be standardized so that the system would function even when the exceptional individuals were unavailable. This difference in approach reflected something deeper about the two armies and the two societies that had built them. The Wehrmacht had been designed to win quickly, through operational brilliance, before the material disadvantages of Germany's position could make themselves felt. The American army had been designed, consciously or not, to win slowly, through the systematic application of resources, in a war that lasted long enough for American industrial and organizational capacity to become decisive. By 1945, that war had arrived, and German commanders were experiencing the consequences. The Falaise pocket in August of 1944 had been, in many respects, the clearest demonstration of what American artillery could accomplish when given the opportunity to work at scale. Two German armies, the 5th Panzer Army and the 7th Army, the same forces that had contested every Allied advance since the Normandy landings, were encircled by converging Allied forces near the Norman town of Falaise. What followed was not, strictly speaking, a battle. It was an execution. American and British artillery, firing from positions surrounding the pocket, maintained continuous fire on German forces, attempting to escape through the narrow gap that remained open. The roads through the pocket became killing grounds. Vehicles, horses, artillery pieces, and men were destroyed in such numbers that Allied commanders who drove through the area afterward described scenes that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. The stench of death was detectable from miles away. The destruction was so complete, so absolute, that it seemed almost beyond the capacity of artillery to have produced. But artillery had produced it. American guns, coordinated through the Fire Direction Center system, had maintained accurate and sustained fire on a defined area for days, and the result was the near annihilation of two German armies. Approximately 50,000 German soldiers were captured. Perhaps 10,000 were killed. The equipment losses were staggering: hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles, virtually the entire artillery complement of both armies. German officers who survived Falaise and were subsequently captured spoke about the experience in ways that suggested something beyond professional military assessment. Bayerlein, who had survived both the Cobra bombardment and the later fighting in the pocket, described the Falaise road as the worst thing he had seen in 5 years of war. This was a man who had seen the Western Desert, who had been at El Alamein, who had watched the destruction of the Afrika Korps. What American artillery had done in the Falaise pocket exceeded all of it. The legacy of what German commanders observed about American artillery extended far beyond the Second World War itself. The after-action assessments, the post-war interviews, the formal studies conducted by American military historians in the years immediately following the German surrender, all of these preserved a body of professional military opinion that shaped how the American Army thought about artillery for generations afterward. The Fire Direction Center system, validated so thoroughly by the war's experience, remained the foundation of American artillery doctrine through the Cold War and beyond. The principle of massed, responsive, flexible fires, delivered faster than any enemy could react, became so deeply embedded in American military thinking that later generations of officers sometimes forgot it had ever been anything other than obvious. It was not obvious. It had been earned, battle by battle, through the painful education of an army learning its trade against a formidable enemy. And that enemy, for all its professionalism and courage, had been forced to acknowledge what it was facing. Hasso von Manteuffel, who spent his post-war years in West German politics and remained a thoughtful commentator on military affairs until his death in 1978, returned repeatedly in his writings and interviews to the question of what had made American forces so formidable in the final year of the war. His answer was consistent. It was not, he argued, any single weapon or any single commander. It was the system, the American ability to combine resources, training, and doctrine into something that was greater than the sum of its parts. The artillery was the clearest expression of this. It was not simply that the Americans had more guns, though they did. It was not simply that American shells were better, though in some respects they were. It was that the Americans had built a method for using artillery that multiplied the effectiveness of every gun they possessed, that made the whole vastly more powerful than any count of individual pieces would suggest. Manteuffel had studied military history deeply. He knew that every great army in history had struggled with the problem of bringing firepower to bear quickly and accurately on fleeting targets. The Romans had faced it with their siege engines. Napoleon had faced it with his cannon. Every army that fought in the First World War had faced it with the massive artillery concentrations that turned the Western Front into a charnel house. The Americans had not merely addressed this problem. They had solved it systematically and reproducibly, in a way that could be taught to ordinary men and relied upon under the worst conditions combat produced. This was, Manteuffel concluded, a form of military genius. Not the individual genius of the inspired commander, but the institutional genius of an army that had figured out how to make the ordinary extraordinary. When the last German forces surrendered in May of 1945, the men who laid down their arms included some of the most professionally accomplished soldiers in the history of warfare. They had fought with skill and courage against opponents who eventually outmatched them not through superior individual quality but through superior system. The German army had been defeated by logistics, by production, by training pipelines, and by a fire direction system developed in the Oklahoma dust of Fort Sill by officers whose names appear in no history books and whose faces appear in no documentary films. Fritz Bayerlein lived until 1970. He gave numerous interviews to American and German military historians, and he returned consistently to the events of July 1944, to that afternoon in the Norman farmland when he watched his division cease to exist. He never entirely made peace with what had happened. How could he? But he understood it, eventually, with the clarity that only time and distance can provide. The Americans, he concluded, had not beaten the Panzer Lehr division because American soldiers were individually better than German soldiers. He did not believe that, and the evidence did not support it. They had beaten it because they had built a system for killing that was more effective than anything the Wehrmacht had developed, and because they had the resources and the trained manpower to sustain that system through every phase of a long and brutal war. He said this not with bitterness, but with the professional respect of a soldier who had been beaten fairly, by opponents who had earned their victory through hard work and sound thinking, applied consistently over years. That, in the end, is what German generals really thought about American artillery in the Second World War. The assessments varied in detail and emphasis. Some commanders were more generous than others. Some focused on specific engagements. Some addressed the broader systemic questions. But the underlying conclusion was remarkably consistent across every senior German officer who addressed the subject honestly. The Americans had solved the central problem of modern artillery: how to bring massed fire to bear quickly, accurately, and flexibly across a fluid battlefield, in a way that no other army had matched. They had done it not through inspiration but through institution. Not through the genius of individuals but through the patient, unglamorous work of building a system that worked even when individuals failed. German generals who had grown up in a military tradition that celebrated the inspired commander, the bold stroke, the audacious maneuver. These men looked at what the Americans had built and recognized, with the honesty that defeat sometimes forces upon the proud, that a different kind of military excellence had beaten them. An excellence that was harder to see and harder to celebrate than the lone hero's triumph, but more durable, more reliable, and ultimately more deadly. The guns are silent now. The farmland of Normandy is green and quiet. The roads through the Ardennes carry tourists, not tanks. The fields near Falaise hold no trace of what was destroyed there in that August of 1944. But the lesson that German generals learned and acknowledged with remarkable candor in the years after the fighting stopped endures. Systems outlast heroes. Doctrine outlasts brilliance. And an army that can make the ordinary extraordinary, day after day, across thousands of miles and years of war, will in the end defeat an army that relies on the extraordinary alone. That is what the guns really said, over the hedgerows and the snow-covered forests and the burning roads of Western Europe. And the men who had been on the receiving end of those guns heard the message clearly, even if it took them years to find the words. If this kind of deeply researched history is what brings you back to this channel, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Every story we tell is built on the same commitment to getting the facts right that you've come to expect. Leave a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Our community spans continents and generations, and every voice in it matters.